Okay, here's the story. It started really in 1942. You know, the Civil Air Patrol was begun in the summer of 1941. And in 1942, in the fall, I was in the senior class at Central High School in Minneapolis. And a Civil Air Patrol cadet squadron was started in our school. And it was the first cadet squadron in the United States, Squadron 7114. And of course, the only thing they had to model on at that time was the military. So everything that was involved with the Civil Air Patrol was basically military. You got the training in the marching and all the maneuvers and everything. Right. We also had classes in navigation and first aid and whatever. But that was my first initiation into things that were quasi-military. And then in February, I tried to enlist in the Navy Air Corps. And the first thing was an eye test. And they set me down in the chair and they said, read that third line on the chart over there. And I said, where? And that was the end of my Navy career. And I went to the eye doctor, and of course I had some eye problems. And he fitted me with glasses and said, all right, now you start drinking a lot of carrot juice. He said, your eyes aren't so bad that they can't be cured. And so I did. And that was in February of '43. And I graduated then in June, early June of '43. And all of my buddies and friends, they were all enlisting in the various military services, you know. And it wasn't but a few weeks, and I was pretty much alone. And the first part of July, I got notice from the Selective Service Board to report to Fort Snelling for the draft. So I went out, went through the physical, and one of the last things they checked was the urinalysis. And I flunked it. And they said, you come back tomorrow and we'll recheck you. So I did, and flunked it again. And they said, your albumin's too high. That indicates you've got kidney problems. We don't want you. And so I went back home and immediately got an appointment with our family doctor. And I went in and saw him fairly early one morning. And urinalysis, went through all the tests and everything. And he come back out in a little bit and he says, what did you have for breakfast? Well, I said, just what I usually have. I had some fried bacon and eggs and toast and carrot juice and milk. He says, there's nothing wrong with you. He says, the only thing that they're reading is the albumin and the eggs you ate for breakfast. He said, there's nothing wrong with you at all. So that made me happy from that standpoint. And I went home, and in a couple of days, why, here I get the card from the Selective Service classifying me as 4F. And I put it in my pocket and went the work I worked at. I was working for the National Tea Company Bakery at that time. And decided in late August, damn it, I'm going to try again because there's nothing wrong with me. So I went down to the Air Force recruiting office down at the old Federal building and went in there, and the first thing was a mental examination. They put you through a series of tests, and they ran about 3 hours. And boy, they were complete. You know, they run everything. And as I was leaving, that lieutenant stopped me, the young lieutenant that was handling it. He said, you know, you had one of the highest scores in this class. And, oh, okay. And the next day we went to the physical. And they had what they called the Flying 6-4. And that was for people that were going into pilot training. And you got the very most stringent physical examination. And I passed it with flying colors, vision and all, 20/20. And on the 3rd of September then, I was sworn in. And went into the reserve because when you enlisted at that time, you didn't go immediately onto active duty. And I was called back then 2 weeks later, and on the 25th of September 1943, why I loaded up there at the old Milwaukee Depot and headed for Keesler Field down in Biloxi, Mississippi for basic training.
After basic training, where'd you end up?
I ended up going to college for 6 months.
How'd that happen?
Well, you see, officers, if they were being put together right out of high school, they needed a little bit more education than the guy that there was going to be under them. So at that time, a part of the training for pilot training or officer training was 6 months of college. And so I went through basic training down there at Keesler Field. Early in December then, we shipped out, had no idea where we were going. We were 3 days on a train, and finally, after the end of the second day, we were in Chicago, and we knew we were heading north someplace. And the following morning, we ended up in Houghton, Michigan. And there's a Michigan College of Mining and Technology is up there because there was a big copper mine over at Hancock, right across the canal. And we went into college training then for 6 months up there. Well, we didn't get 6 months of training. We only got 5 months. And there was kind of a question, well, you know, how come things are being squeezed down here? And in the process, we'd also started getting some flight training. They were putting us through 10 hours of training in small aircraft. Arancas is what we were flying up there. But it was on skis. And so we got our 10 hours of dual flight time in the Arancas. And in May then, why, they closed down. We were the last class in the college. Nobody came in behind us. The program was closed down. And I was shipped to Santa Ana, California for pre-flight. And that was supposed to be a 6 weeks program. And that only lasted about 4.5 to 5 weeks. But we went through some special testing out there. We went through night vision testing, which lasted about 3 hours because you had to spend nearly 2 hours phasing in the darkness before you could go in and actually take the test. And then went through psychological testing. There was a guy in our class that was about 26, right at the edge. 26 years was the cutoff. They wouldn't accept anybody in pilot training over 26 years old. And he was right at the upper edge. But he'd been flying already. He and his wife were both test pilots for North American, flying B-25s. He flunked. He didn't pass the psychological testing. And that kind of amazed everybody, you know. God, if he ain't going to make it, how are the rest of us going to do it? But the guys that I'd been going through training with, all of a sudden, almost all of them were gone. There was 80 of us that had been going through basic training and through college, and they were all gone except about 2 other guys and myself. Have no idea whatever happened to them. And I ended up being shipped to Tucson, Arizona, to what was called Ryan Field, and I guess it still is. It was an airport that was built by Ryan Aircraft to get away from San Diego, because they couldn't fly out there because of the hazard of being attacked by the Japanese. So of course they provided their own airplanes. Well, when I got there, the Ryans weren't being flown anymore. They were flying Stearman biplanes. So I went through Stearman training, got my 65 hours in there, and then went to basic flight over at Marana, which was up northwest of Tucson. And I was involved there. I had 6 hours, my first 6 hours of flight training with the BT-13s. I had 5 different instructors. That don't happen.
Now, when you finished all the flight training, where did you go next?
Well, I didn't finish all my flight training. This is where it gets weird. During that 6th hour, and my 5th instructor, and I was his first student, we took off and went up, and we were probably around 5,000 feet or so. And he was going to demonstrate something. And instead of doing what he was supposed to do, he didn't properly clear airspace before he started his maneuver. And as he pulled the nose of that BT up, I'm looking directly at a T-6 coming at me. And I grabbed the controls and dumped him, and that bird went right over us. And I swear to God, you could count the rivets in the wing as it went by. And all he could say was, "Take me home." So I went back and landed and taxied in and parked. And I was climbing out of the cockpit, and he couldn't move. He was scared so damn bad he could not get out of that cockpit. And he said, "You tried to kill me." And I laid into him. I told him what I thought of him in no uncertain terms. And of course, he was an officer and I was a cadet officer. And that meant that I was up for court-martial. So I went back to the barracks. They told me to go report back to my quarters. And the captain came around that was in charge of our group that evening, and he told me, he said, "If you want me to go to bat for you," he said, "I think we can get this straightened out." And I told him, "Captain," I said, "if I've got to serve with a son of a bitch like that," I said, "I can do without it." And they lined me up with a review board that they have. And instead of getting involved with what had happened, they just had a little conference among themselves. I was never talked to. All they did is stand me up to see who I was. And there was 5 officers, and the top one was a colonel. And they told me that I was to report the following evening on the flight line at 6 o'clock, that I was going to go through a flight test to see what my status was. So the next evening, well, I showed up down there, and there was a major that was going to give me the test. And he come out. We were walking out to the plane, and he told me, he says, "Well," he says, "you can make this as easy or as tough as you want to." And it never clicked in my head what he was saying. So we went up and we started flying, and I went through all the maneuvers he asked for. And what normally happened is if you flunked one of them, all he would say is, "Let's go home." He never said that. And we were probably around 4,000 feet or so, and he pulled the power and said, "Forced landing." So I went down, made an approach, and did what I was supposed to do for forced landing. And he put the power on, we climbed back up. That happened 6 times. We went through forced landings, kept getting lower and lower and lower. The requirement was that if you were 200 feet or below, you could not turn. You had to land straight ahead. Well, the last time he pulled the power on me, we were just under 200 feet. And by that time, it had dawned on me, what he had told me when we were walking to the airplane was, I was not going to pass. Basically, that's what he was saying. So I proceeded, I saw a nice patch there about 15 degrees off to the left, and I just turned the airplane into it and went down, and all he said was, "Let's go home." So I flunked the flight test at that point. Well, that was the end of that. But what they did, you see, that instead of having me go before a court-martial board for disrespect to an officer, where the whole story would have come out, where he had violated, not me. They saved his ass and sacrificed mine, okay? And a few days later, I got orders to report to Sioux Falls Army Air Base, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, for airborne radio operation and mechanic training. Now, normally when people went out of flight training, they went into a pool and they went every place. Infantry, artillery, quartermaster, you know, engineers, whatever. Because it was just another Army unit. And here I ended up going back into flight training of some kind. So I went up to Sioux Falls. That was a 26-week school. And I got about, a little over halfway through it, and my dad died, and I got a 2-week emergency leave. And when I came back, well, I was, of course, lost 2 classes. And started back in school again, no problem. And I got up to about the 20th week, and the word came out, the school's closing. 2 weeks. So instead of getting my total number of weeks in, I was 2 weeks shy. And those last 2 weeks were the actual in-flight training, where they actually put you on an airplane. You got about 10 hours of flight time, learning how to physically operate the equipment in the air. Well, I didn't finish. Everything but 2 weeks. And they shipped me off to Truax Field at Madison, Wisconsin. Ground radio maintenance. I'd just gone through all of that training at Sioux Falls. And I told him, I said, you're wasting your time and my time both here. I said, I've done all this before. So they gave me a test, and I passed the final examination, and I was automatically given credit for 20 weeks school after 3 weeks. Then they shipped me on to Chanute Field at Rantoul, Illinois. And that was electronics. And just the last week or two of that, Hiroshima happened. And just after that, then I was shipped to Boca Raton, Florida. Boca Raton Army Air Base for radar training. And while I was in radar training, and of course this was by that time November, and they went through a hurricane warning down there, and they had to evacuate the B-17s and B-24s that were the training aircraft. And I decided that, they were asking for people that could help crew the airplanes, so I went down to operations and told them that I was qualified as a radio operator. And they checked my records, and they put me on a B-17 as an airborne radio operator, and we went to Lambert Field, St. Louis, and then returned. So I did get actually some experience as an airborne radio operator. And then right after that, Boca Raton closed down. They didn't have any more need for flight crews, And they shipped me back to Chanute Field for reassignment. And I received assignment as a ground-to-air radio operator in Sioux City, Iowa.
Jeez.
And before I could be shipped out there, that was canceled, and I was sent for discharge back in St. Louis. I arrived back home on the morning of March 11th, 1946, my 21st birthday.
Christ, talk about move you around the country.
Yeah. And I still don't understand how I ended up in all that electronics.
Did you ever use it when you got out?
Not when I got out, but I was recalled. I was in the South Dakota Air National Guard, and I was recalled for Korea.
Oh.
And in the meantime, I'd gone through aircraft maintenance school at DePotty's at Wold Chamberlain, and had become FAA certified. And I had a private pilot's license by that time as well. And when I was recalled, all of that background became involved in my assignments. Because I spent 15 years in the Air Force then as an inspector. Inspecting aircraft and gradually inspecting everything. Well, I was also qualified not just to look at the airplane, but check communications, radar, and with other training, why, a whole variety of things. In fact, they even sent me to engine school, and I ended up with an engine certification.
Did you ever get out of the country at all?
Oh yeah, we spent 3 years in Europe, in France, in a couple of different outfits, and then I was in the Philippines and Vietnam.
Vietnam, what year was that then?
1965-66.
Oh, okay.
Early.
Now you were part of the Air Force at this time.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were Air Force inspector. You ended up whereabouts in Nam? Well, first of all, did you ever get to Korea?
No.
Okay. And Nam, you ended up where?
At Da Nang.
Oh, that's a big air base operation. Isn't it?
Oh God, and that was weird because actually I was there TDY out of the Philippines, and I was what they called combat damage control for B-57s, and that's where I also got involved with Agent Orange because those C-123 ranch hand aircraft were parked right in our area, and they were dripping on you all the time, and that was a mess. I ended up not only with the B-57s, but they moved F-102s in there as well. And the F-102s were at the south end of the runway, and the B-57s were at the north end of the runway. And I was spread a little thin.
So you were based and you stayed at Da Nang all the time?
Yeah.
Okay, in '65 you got out of there?
Well, no, I come home in November of '66.
Okay. And then at what point did you then leave the Air Force?
I retired on April 30th, 1969.
Wow. And you, where were you at the time? You
Grand Forks Air Force Base.
Forks in your backyard.
I only served on 2 bases in the United States after I was recalled in 1951. I served 2 tours at Rapid City, and I served 2 tours at Grand Forks in fighter outfits.
Wow. Would you ever go back to Vietnam to see it, or you don't care?
No, no. We had no business there in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't really come to that final realization until they shipped me there, and I got to see how that whole operation was being run. Now we had our guys, these young kids, 19, 20, 21, man, they're working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, you know, on the flight lines, and busting their butts.
Mm-hmm.
And we were required by the agreement that 10% of whatever aircraft we have assigned there that are not, well, I shouldn't say assigned, that are there because of TDY and not permanent assignment, the 10% of them must be manned by Vietnamese crews. So we had 20 at any one time, B-57s there. That meant that 2 of them had to be manned by Vietnamese crews. Those ground crews came to work at 7 in the morning. Ours came to work at 5. They knocked off at 4. They put them there 8 hours, with an hour for lunch. And they worked 5 days a week. They're putting in 40 hours. Our guys are putting in, cripes, 712s, 84 hours a week or so, you know. And I figured, God, if they can't fight their own battles, what the hell are we doing?
Okay, good point.
And then there was, while I was there in that June of '66, there was a rebellion among the Vietnamese forces. Their I Corps, it was commanded by a general by the name of Big Min, is what they called him. And it was stationed right there at Da Nang. That was Army. And they rebelled against that colonel that was the president, that had been appointed as president of Vietnam. And their troops were firing through the fences on Da Nang Air Base because the Vietnamese had an Air Force unit there. Some of their Marines were stationed there, and there was a Vietnamese hospital on the base. Well, we had GIs getting killed by supposedly friendly Vietnamese troops. And it got so bad that all the aircraft were evacuated off of Da Nang and sent to other bases around Vietnam to get them the hell out of there. Well, because I wasn't assigned to any aircraft group, I was assigned to the wing level at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. When the aircraft all left with their crews, I'm sitting there by myself. And I'd go out and sit down in these aircraft bunkers we had there. They had a big bunch of them that would hold two B-57s at a time for protection from ground fire. And I'd go out and spend my day reading and sitting down in one of those bunkers. Well, I'm sitting there one day, and here comes a ricochet in around that bunker area, and it rolled right up alongside my leg. I've got it put away someplace. And that's as close as I ever came to combat. we would get mortared periodically because about 100 yards, I was going to say about from here to that garbage can over here from where I'm sitting,
Yeah.
was their fuel dump. And their fuel dump was great big rubber bladders. God, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of gallons those things held. And there was 3 of them on this slope. And they'd keep firing for those, and occasionally they'd hit them, but because of the resilience of the fluid in the bladder, the mortar shell would just fall off and not go off. There wouldn't be enough concussion to cause it to explode. And occasionally we'd walk off to work in the morning, and there'd be a mortar shell laying around there on the ground, you know, that EOD hadn't quite picked up yet. And I came back in November of 66, and in late January, they made a hit. And I watched those fuel cells burn up, and the new post office that they just built, but just before I left over there. And I had, because my duty was a 24-hour kind. I worked a standard shift every day, but I was also on call 24 hours for any kind of damage that might happen to one of the aircraft. And it was up to me to determine what the repair facility was, everything that was involved, when it might come back into commission and all this stuff. And I had gotten permission to build a little day room for the airmen. They didn't have a damn thing to do after they did get off work, you know. And I figured, well, hell, if they got a place they can go and sit and maybe have a beer if they want to of their own that they're keeping in a refrigerator and play cards or whatever they want to, why, it would be a benefit to everybody. So I requested permission from Clark Air Base if I could do that. And they gave me the permission and shipped me a carpenter kit when they replaced one of the airplanes. So I'd gone ahead and gotten a little day room pretty much put together before I left out of there, and then they'd completed it, and I sat there and watched that burn. right outside of the hooch I'd been living in. Yeah.
Now, did you fly back to the States from there?
Yeah, we come back on Continental Airlines.
Oh, okay.
Continental, I don't remember when they changed colors, but there was a period there during the 60s and 70s when they were all gold.
Oh.
And I came back on one of their gold planes out of Clark then.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, but there's some people here that were part of Air America, and they were kickers and pilots.
Okay.
Living in Bemidji.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I don't have anything else to add. That's a long career in the military.
Well, and all I talked about was up through Vietnam.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But you were involved in all three wars.
Yeah.
Indirectly. Yeah.
Yeah. And I got involved when I was stationed in France. That was when I got my first top secret clearance. Because we were in an outfit that was entirely different than anything else in the Air Force. I was with an F-86 outfit at the Chambly Air Base in France, up near, not too far out of Metz. And we were doing what was called toss bombing. We were toss bombing or practicing toss bombing nuclear weapons. And what they would do, these F-86s, you'd load an atomic weapon on the airplane, and then of course you'd start a dive, and then as you started up, you'd lob.
Yep.
And
using dummies, I assume.
What? Yeah, that's what we'd practice with, and we did most of our flying down at Tripoli, Libya, for training. Wheelus Air Base down there.
In Libya, is that still there today, I assume?
I'm assuming it is. That, I think, is probably their airport. That airport was originally a racetrack built by Mussolini. And then it was converted to an airport with the main straightaway.
Huh.
And we used it for a lot of years. I was on 2 different trips down there. One of them with F-86s and then one of them with F-100s. And it was weird.
You're probably right. It's probably the international airport.
I would guess it is. Yeah.
Wow.
Because it was right on the edge of town at that time. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that's a pretty complete story. Thank you for doing this and taking the time to tell me about it, because a lot of people don't fully understand what a lot of our citizens here in Bemidji have gone through.
Well,
So
you know,
it's important that they know about it.
I think that in some ways I was very, very fortunate because of the experience I had. I also got involved early on in weight and balance. Most people don't even know what I'm talking about when I mention weight and balance for airplanes.
Well, I fly too, so I understand.
Yeah. Well, I ended up weighing airplanes. physically weighing airplanes. Most people don't even realize that you can weigh an airplane. And size doesn't make any difference, you know.
Oh, sure.
So I ended up, well, I was the weight and balance technician at Clark Air Base, and they had 175 airplanes there, all different kinds, and I weighed a lot of them.